Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Meaghan Callahan. I'm a senior policy researcher with the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation. The Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation is a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy organization focused on state and local fiscal, tax, and economic policies. And it's our mission to provide accurate, unbiased research with thoughtful recommendations that strengthen the state's finances and economy to foster the long-term well-being of the Commonwealth and economic opportunity for all. We really appreciate you all being here with us this morning to review the fiscal year 24 House budget and the specific investments that it makes in municipalities, K-12 education, and higher education. Like I said, I left some time at the end of the presentation for questions. We have Ashley White from our team joining us this morning, so please feel free to put them in the chat. She's going to be helping me monitor those questions, and we'll get to all of them at the end. But in terms of what we're going to cover this morning, I'm going to start off by offering an update on fiscal year 2023 as we head into the final 3 months of the fiscal year. Then I'm going to speak about the fiscal year 2024 budget process to date, before getting into the specific investments that the House makes in municipalities, K-12 education, higher education, before moving on to some notable education policy proposals and reviewing what took place last week during the House debate process. So starting off with an update on fiscal year 2023, the 5 things that we think it's really helpful to know looking into the final months of the fiscal year. So number 1, tax revenue growth is flat 8 months into the fiscal year. In fiscal year 2022, revenue growth through March was running about 22% ahead of fiscal year 2021. So really significant revenue growth last year. Compare that to this year, revenue growth through March is at negative 0.2%. So basically level with where things were last year at the same time. Number 2, Governor Healy on March 29th signed into law the first supplemental budget of fiscal year 2023 and the first of her administration. It included $388 million in direct appropriations. And there's a second supplemental budget currently pending with the legislature that Governor Healy filed. That includes about $734 million in direct appropriations. Non-withheld income is $1.1 billion, or about 30% below where it was in fiscal year 2022. And there continues to be some further downside risk in the final months of the fiscal year. And non-withheld income are those most volatile sources of revenue that the state collects, including things like capital gains and estimated payments. And then numbers 4 and 5, effectively all state ARPA dollars have been obligated. So the state received about $5.3 billion in federal fiscal recovery funds through the American Rescue Plan Act. And through 2 different ARPA appropriations bills, nearly all of them have been obligated. But there remains about $1.7 billion in state surplus funds set aside in the Transitional Escrow Fund. A small portion of that is unobligated ARPA dollars, and those resources continue to be available to state budget writers. This graph aims to put those flat revenue collections through March in fiscal year 2023 into some greater context. So the blue bars in this chart are looking at the tax revenue benchmarks for fiscal year 2023 versus fiscal year 2022. And the yellow bars are looking at actual tax revenue collections compared to last year's actual tax revenue collections. So the main takeaway here in this chart is that budget writers expected state tax revenues in fiscal year 2023 to fall much farther below fiscal year 22 actual collections by a much larger margin than what we've actually seen. So we're doing much better than what our expectations were in terms of tax collections through March. To offer a little bit more detail on the supplemental budget that Governor Healy signed on March 29th, in total, it was a $1.1 billion bill, including those $388 million in direct appropriations and $740 million in bond authorizations. About $173 million of those direct appropriations are directly related to education spending. So we saw $65 million for the continuation of the Universal School Meals Program through the end of this school year, $40 million for a support services and school district reserve, and that's intended to provide some additional aid to school districts who are seeing increased student enrollment numbers related to new migrants or immigrants moving into the state and being placed in these districts. And then lastly, it included $68 million for the C3 Child Care Stabilization Grant Program, which is under the Department of Early Education and Care. This is helping to contextualize that remaining $1.7 billion in state surplus and ARPA dollars. So back in fiscal year 2021, through the American Rescue Plan Act, the state received that $5.3 billion in federal fiscal recovery funds. In the first ARPA appropriations bill passed in 2021, about half of that money had been spent. And then in fiscal year 2022, it was supplemented by an additional $2.4 billion in state surplus resources set aside in the Transitional Escrow Fund. A second ARPA appropriations bill was passed in December of 2022, spending a lot of those resources, and that's how we end up with about 1.7 total in fiscal year 2023 remaining, 1.4 in surplus, and about 300 in ARPA dollars. And then the last slide I have for you on fiscal year 2023 is related to the growth in state reserve funds. So the state stabilization fund balance has really increased pretty substantially over the last 10 years. And in fiscal year 2022 and fiscal year 2023, it's also been supplemented by some newly created trust funds. So most namely, we have that transitional escrow fund with $1.4 billion remaining. And then there are two specifically related to education. So we have the Student Opportunity Act Trust Fund created in the fiscal year 2022 budget. It currently has about $350 million in resources. And then we have the EEC Trust Fund, which has about $490 million in resources. So all of these funds continue to be available to state budget writers through the remainder of fiscal year 23 and into fiscal year 2024. So moving on now to the fiscal year 2024 House budget. When the House Ways and Means Committee released their budget proposal, MTF put out a really comprehensive 30-page report. It's available on our website, but if you don't want to read through that whole report, we did condense it into this top 5 things that you need to know list. So number 1, the House budget reflects the first year phasing costs of a $1.1 billion tax policy reform package. Number 2, it creates a structure to collect, track, and use income surtax revenues. That's similar, but a slightly more complicated than the governor's plan, and I'm going to detail that later on in the presentation. Number 3, House surtax spending focuses more on K-12 education and the MBTA, less on higher education and early education compared to the governor. The House prioritizes, in general, investments across the education sector, including funding things like the continuation of the Universal School Meals Program at $161 million. And then lastly, the House budget includes a total of 93 outside policy sections, including the legalization of online lottery, known as iLottery, and adding an appointee of the mayor of Boston to the MBTA board. To look a little bit deeper at the revenue and the resources that the House uses to balance their fiscal year 24 budget, like the governor's budget, the House budget is built on that consensus revenue foundation of $40.4 billion, which was agreed to by administrative and legislative leaders back in January. And the 24 consensus revenue estimate is assuming 1.6% growth over fiscal year 2023. The House budget also includes and reflects that $1.1 billion tax relief plan, like I mentioned earlier, and that includes 7 major tax relief proposals. This table summarizes them and some of the key policy and timeline differences between the House's tax package and the governor's. So on the child independent tax credit, both the governor and the House are recommending an increase to the credit to $600 per dependent and removing the dependent cap. But whereas the governor is implementing that change fully in tax year 2023, the House bill is implementing it over 3 years. So we'll see full implementation by tax year 2026. For the rental deduction and the senior circuit breaker tax credit, the policy and the timeline are exactly the same in both the governor and the House's tax bill. The max rental deduction is increased to $4,000, and the senior circuit breaker base tax credit is doubled to $2,400. And that change is implemented, both of those changes are implemented fully for tax year 2023. On the estate tax, we saw the governor increase it from $1 million to $3 million. And in the House, we see it increased only to $2 million. But in both instances, that tax again is implemented fully in tax year 2023. And then on short-term capital gains, the policy is the same, a reduction in the rate from 12% to 5%. But again, while the governor does that fully this year, the House phases it in over 2 years for full implementation by 2024. And then the earned income tax credit and single sales factor apportionment are two proposals that are unique to the House's tax package. On the earned income tax credit, the House recommends increasing the state match from 30 to 40% of the federal credit, and that change would be implemented immediately. And then the House bill also includes single sales factor apportionment. This was not reflected in the governor's tax package, but under the House's plan, that change wouldn't be made until tax year 2025. And so in terms of what the House's tax package means for the fiscal year 2024 budget, in fiscal year 2024, its cost is $537 million. And the reason that cost is so much less than the larger $1.1 billion price tag is related to really just two things. So number one, the proposal to reduce the short-term capital gains rate from 12% to 5% actually has no impact on the amount of revenue that's available for the state budget. Capital gains collections above a certain threshold are automatically deposited into the state's rainy day fund. And so when we reduce the short-term capital gains rate to 5%, we're not reducing the amount of revenues that are available to support budgeted spending. We're just reducing the amount of revenue that would eventually be deposited into the state stabilization fund. And then cost savings in fiscal year 2024 under the House plan are also derived from phasing in a number of those policy changes, namely to the child independent tax credit and to single sales apportionment. So that's how we get from that $1.1 billion price down to 537 in fiscal year 2024. I'm going to speak now to the House's plan for spending income surtax revenues or millionaires tax revenues. And so to collect, track, and spend income surtax revenues, the House creates a process that largely mirrors the framework that was proposed by the governor. This table goes through all of the elements. I'm not going to touch on every single one, but I'm going to talk through a few of the key similarities and differences. So the first key difference is that to collect and spend income surtax revenues, the governor creates just one trust fund, but the House creates three. So the governor's proposal creates the Education and Transportation Trust Fund, and the House's proposal creates the Education and Transportation Trust Fund, the Education and Transportation Stabilization Fund, and the Education and Transportation Innovation Fund. Both the governor and the House create a new budget section for income surtax spending, Section 2F. But while the governor includes specific line item language that dictates whether those expenditures are one-time or recurring in nature, we don't see that same kind of language in the House's budget. And so there's a little bit more ambiguity there in terms of how those resources are being used. And then the last major difference in their plans is how they treat collections above the spending cap. So during January's consensus revenue process, the administration, the House, and the Senate agreed to only spend $1 billion of income surtax revenue in fiscal year 2024. The governor is proposing that collections above that $1 billion cap be available for one-time use only, whereas the House is proposing that collections above that $1 billion cap are being diverted to two of their new trust funds. So 15% of collections above the cap go into the Surtax Stabilization Fund, and 85% of those collections above the cap go into the Innovation Fund. And it's not immediately clear from House budget language what resources in the Innovation Fund could potentially be used for. It's a little open-ended, but it's possible that they'd also be available for things like one-time uses. This slide details two other elements of the income surtax proposals. We have the annual spending cap and then the minimum fund or stabilization fund balances. So like I mentioned, fiscal year 2024, there's that $1 billion spending cap, and it was agreed to by every branch, so the administration, the House, and the Senate. In fiscal year 2025, the governor increases that cap by 3% to $1.03 billion, and sets a minimum fund balance at 33% of that spending cap, so $343 million. In future years, the House proposes that the spending cap be set annually by the administration, the House, and the Senate, and that the balance of the surtax stabilization fund be 33% of whatever that spending limit ends up being. So a key difference between the governor and the House's proposal is that whereas the governor is establishing a minimum fund balance of at least 33% of the annual spending cap, we see in the House's plan that they're establishing a maximum surtax stabilization fund balance of 33% of the annual spending cap. When the balance of the surtax stabilization fund under the House's plan exceeds 33% of that spending cap, those additional resources are diverted back to the Education and Transportation Innovation Fund. And then this slide looks in a little bit more detail on how those income surtax revenues are being deployed in fiscal year 2024. So the governor's budget evenly divided revenues between education and transportation, but prioritized investments in one-time costs. So about 60% of the governor's $1 billion in surtax spending goes towards one-time costs. The House is also equally distributing these revenues between education and transportation. But again, they're not specifying whether these investments are one-time or recurring in nature. And then the last slide I have on income surtax spending just goes into a little bit more detail on how these resources are being deployed across different types of categories within the education and transportation buckets. And so you can see that much more spending in the House's budget is being spent on K-12 education, $250 million more than what the governor dedicated to that bucket. And under transportation, much more funding is being directed towards the MBTA and RTAs, less towards the Department of Transportation. So now to speak about spending in the House budget, and before we get to specific investments in municipalities, I'm going to talk kind of big picture about House final versus governor spending. And all in, the House spends about $169.8 million more than the governor. And the largest differences are in those education categories. So for K-12 education, we see the House spending $253.7 million more than the governor. And on early education and higher education, we're seeing them spend about $180 million less. And now most of these differences are being driven by how they're choosing to spend income surtax revenues. Outside of education, the House chooses to spend much more on healthcare, housing, and workforce. But now turning to the specific investments that they include for municipalities. So the House budget funds UGA, or unrestricted general government aid, at $1.25 billion, a $4.9 million decrease compared to the governor's budget. And the House is following the recent practice of increasing local aid for cities and towns by the same percentage growth rate as the consensus tax revenue estimate. So for fiscal year 2024, this is a 1.6% increase in local aid for cities and towns. And talking about local aid in relation to consensus tax revenue is an important comparison for a couple of reasons. So during the Baker administration, funding for UGA was consistently increased by the same percentage growth rate as the consensus tax revenue agreement. And tying local aid to the consensus tax revenue agreement really aimed to improve the predictability of state aid for cities and towns. But what we saw happening in more recent years was this divergence between actual state tax revenue collections and the consensus tax revenue estimates. And we've certainly heard calls from municipalities for some of that revenue to be shared a little bit more equitably among cities and towns across the state. So this chart is really aimed to help illustrate that divergence between growth in UGA funding and growth in state tax revenues. So the blue line is showing UGA funding as it's been reflected in the state budget, where the yellow line is showing how UGA funding would have grown had it been increased by the same percentage as actual revenue growth. So between 2014 and 2020, we really don't see any difference. Consensus tax revenue estimates were more or less keeping up with actual tax revenue collections. But that really starts to change in fiscal year 2021. And we see this big divergence between actual tax revenue collections and the consensus revenue estimate. And so the House budget, and continuing this policy of only increasing UGA by the consensus revenue factor, we see a continuation of this divergence between actual revenue growth and local aid for cities and towns. And in the governor's budget, we saw a slight increase in funding for UGA over the consensus tax revenue percentage up to 2%. The House level funds pilot or payment in lieu of taxes for state-owned land with the governor's budget at $51.5 million, a $6.5 million or 14.4% increase over fiscal year 2023. And this funding level is meant to reflect the most up-to-date property valuations and provide all municipalities with the same or higher payments than in fiscal year 2023. And then this last slide I have for you related to municipalities is actually previewing an upcoming report that MTF is releasing, the Municipal Financial Data Book. It's the 50th edition of that report. And the MFD is MTF's annual compilation of some basic financial information for the Commonwealth's 351 cities and towns. Copies of the Municipal Financial Data Book have been sent to municipalities across the state, and we have some additional copies available if anyone's interested. But to just highlight a couple of the main takeaways from the report, municipal revenues and expenditures increased by 5.7% or $1.8 billion from fiscal year 21 to fiscal year 2022. That's the highest rate of growth since fiscal year 2007. And in fiscal year 2022, that strong rate of growth is partially an artifact of the pandemic. We saw only growth of 1.7% in fiscal year 2021. And then these are statewide trends. So of course, pretty considerable variation exists in municipalities across the state. So this report should be coming out in the next couple of weeks. It'll be on our website, but like I said, copies have been sent to cities and towns across the state. Please feel free to take a look. We're happy to answer any questions that you might have. But turning now to K-12 education, I'm going to start off by talking about Chapter 78. And I'm going to talk first about Chapter 78 in the House budget for fiscal year 2024, and then take a step back and talk a little bit more bigger picture about Student Opportunity Act implementation over the last 3 years. So the House budget funds base Chapter 78 for public schools at $6.6 billion, a $600 million or about 10% increase over last year's budget. And it's basically level with what we saw in the governor's budget. There's a really slight decrease of about $282,000 compared to the governor's budget. And we understand that to be entirely related to some updated enrollment projections available from the department that impact just 2 districts. Where the House diverges from the governor is in increasing minimum aid per pupil from $30 to $60. And they do that through a separate line item funded at a total of $7.9 million. And later on in the presentation, I'm going to talk about what that minimum aid increase means for different types of districts across the state. But to offer a visual on what year over year Chapter 78 growth has looked like over the past decade, beginning in fiscal year 2014 through fiscal year 2022, we were looking at increases to state Chapter 78 of between $100 million and $200 million each year. That really starts to change as we begin to implement the Student Opportunity Act in earnest. We saw an increase last year for Chapter 78 of up to $500 million. And then in 2024, we're seeing that increase of up to $600 million. So that's a really significant growth in the amount of state aid being directed to our K-12 public schools across the state. Now to talk about Student Opportunity Act implementation a little bit more globally. This is just a summary table of the main elements of the foundation budget formula that are impacted by the Student Opportunity Act. So you can see for the foundation budget per pupil rates, employee benefits and fixed charges, low income rates, English learner rates, out-of-district special education, and guidance and psychological rates. We've moved now over the last 3 years from a 1/6 implementation now up to a 3/6 implementation towards those full goal rates as outlined in the law. For low-income student enrollment, the Student Opportunity Act increased the threshold under which we count students as low income from 133% of the federal poverty level to 185%. And we see both the governor and the House's budget reflecting that increased threshold. And DESE is able to count those students up to 185% FPL based on 3 criteria. So it's students who are participating in Mass Health, SNAP, TAFDC, and other public assistance programs, students who are identified as homeless, and then students who are also identified through DESE's new supplemental data collection process. And then minimum aid, the SOA set a floor amount of at least $30 per pupil each year. Of course, we saw that increase to $60 per pupil last year, and we saw the House continue that trend this year. So I think we'll still have to wait and see how the Senate acts on minimum aid in fiscal year 2024. But in terms of what Student Opportunity Act implementation has really meant for districts, since fiscal year 2021, we've seen the statewide foundation budget grow by $2.3 billion, which is huge. And just between fiscal year 23 and fiscal year 2024, we saw growth of over $1 billion. And now foundation budget growth is obviously shared between Chapter 70 state aid to districts, but also increased required local contributions on the part of cities and towns. And I'm going to detail both of those trends. So in terms of the distribution of that increased Chapter 70 aid, across the state, 56% of that increased Chapter 70 aid over the last 3 years has been directed towards just 23 school districts across the state. And these districts are the highest need, lowest income districts. I have them highlighted in this map on the slide. And then the chart on the right side of the slide is looking at how that aid has been distributed to districts across low income groups. So for districts in low income groups 1 through 9, they're experiencing less than 5% of the overall Chapter 78 increases that we've seen over the last 3 years. Whereas for those high needs, low income districts in groups 10, 11, and 12, they're seeing the vast majority of that new state aid being directed towards their schools. This slide offers a similar comparison of looking at state aid growth over the last 3 years, but it also folds in increases to required local contributions over the same time period. So the yellow bars are looking at state aid growth, and the blue bars are looking at increases to required local contributions over the last 3 years. The combination of these two things, state aid and required local contributions, being the overall growth in districts' education costs related to the Student Opportunity Act. So you can see that increasing costs are being met in high needs, low income districts, predominantly through new state aid. So for districts in low income group 12, these are the highest needs districts in the state. Over 90% of their increased education costs are being covered by new state aid. Whereas for middle income districts, maybe those in low income groups 3, 4, or 5, up to 60% of their increased education costs are being covered through larger local contributions coming from their municipalities. And this trend of increasing required local contributions for districts that might not be seeing very large increases in their Chapter 70 aid, I think we really see that reflected in both the governor and the House's budget. And to direct some additional state aid towards those types of districts, both the governor and the House put forward their own proposals. So in the governor's budget, we saw this $10 million extraordinary relief reserve, which is intended to provide some additional state aid to districts who are facing disproportionate increases in their local contributions. The governor's budget didn't include a specific distribution methodology for this reserve, and ultimately we didn't see it included in the House's budget proposal. The House instead chose to increase that minimum aid per pupil amount from $30 to $40, so a total of $7.8 million in additional Chapter 70 aid was being directed to districts to help, I think, target some of these increases to required local contributions. And this last chart I have for you on Chapter 70 is really aiming to illustrate how that minimum aid is being distributed to different types of districts. So this is looking at that increase in Chapter 70 aid associated with increasing minimum per pupil aid to $60 distributed across low income groups. So 67% of that Chapter 78 increase is being directed towards high and middle income communities and low income groups 2 through 8. And these are going to be a similar group of communities that are seeing those increased local contributions without corresponding increases in state aid. The outlier of low-income group 11, I'll just mention quickly, is actually entirely related to the city of Boston. The city of Boston is pretty unique within the foundation budget formula. They educate a really high number of high needs, low-income students, but they also have a really strong local revenue base. And so within the formula, they're considered a minimum aid community, and that's why they're seeing a decent share of this increase to $60 per pupil. But moving on now to some other notable K-12 education spending, starting off with the special education circuit breaker program. So the House budget funds the circuit breaker program at $506 million, or $2.25 million more than the governor. We understand this to mean, based on some of the latest data from DESE, that the House budget is meeting the reimbursement requirements for both instructional costs, but also out-of-district transportation. The House budget also includes Governor Healey's proposal to fund extraordinary relief payments within the circuit breaker program at $20 million. And the extraordinary relief payments program is intended to provide some relief to districts facing increasing special education costs in the current year, in fiscal year 2024. Ordinarily, the special ed circuit breaker program reimburses districts for costs incurred during the prior fiscal year. So in 2024, districts are being reimbursed for costs that they incurred in 2023. The purpose of increasing funding so substantially for extraordinary relief payments is really to help direct some additional aid toward districts that might be impacted by that 14% OSD rate increase related to tuition prices for private special education schools. The House, in addition, increases funding over the governor's budget for two programmatic earmarks that have historically been included in the special ed circuit breaker account. They're a Department of Developmental Services Residential Placement Prevention Program, and then Best Buddies Massachusetts. And then I'll just mention as well, related to circuit breaker, that in that second supplemental budget proposal filed by Governor Healey and currently with the legislature, there's an additional $75 million for extraordinary relief payments included. So all in, Governor Healey has proposed nearly $100 million for extraordinary relief payments to districts for fiscal year 2024. Some other notable education reimbursement accounts. The House budget includes $232.7 million for charter tuition reimbursement. This is slightly less than what was included in the governor's budget. But again, based on some updated data from DESE, we think that this fully meets the 100% reimbursement requirement. This funding level also reflects the $2.4 million increase that the House adopted during House debate, which is intended to increase the charter tuition per pupil facilities aid rate from $1,088 to $1,188. And the per pupil facilities aid rate directs additional funding to charter schools for capital maintenance costs and building repair, things like that. And that cost, that aid, is entirely reimbursed to sending districts by the state. So increasing the rate sends some additional funding to charter schools, but it doesn't impact sending districts because it's fully reimbursed by the state. The House goes further than the governor to fully fund regional school transportation at $108 million. They exclude funding for the non-resident vocational transportation program, and then they match the governor to fully fund homeless student transportation at $29 million. The House budget, like I mentioned earlier, includes $161 million for the continuation of the Universal School Meals Program, and they do this entirely with the support of income surtax revenue. We did not see universal school meals included in Governor Healey's fiscal year 2024 budget proposal, but she did include $171 million through a supplemental budget to fund the continuation of the program for a new school year. The House budget also includes two outside sections related to universal school meals and making it permanent. So Section 15 would require all public elementary, secondary, and vocational schools to make breakfast and lunch available at no charge to all students. And then Section 18 would remove a section of general law that would require a school district to notify a student's family of any unpaid student meal debt. Rural school aid. Fiscal year 2024 is actually the first chance that policymakers have to act on some recommendations that came out of the Rural School Districts Commission, which was created under the Student Opportunity Act in 2019 and released its final report last July. One of their main recommendations included increasing funding for rural school aid pretty substantially. And we've seen pretty substantial increases for that program. So the governor included $7.5 million for rural school aid. The House budget increases that to $10 million. That doesn't quite reach the level that was recommended or requested by the commission, but it is notable to look at the $8.5 million increase that this program has seen just in the last 5 or 6 years. The last slide I have on K-12 education actually talks about 2 notable investments and policy proposals that the House budget includes related to public school infrastructure. So first, we have this Green School Works program, and that's supported using $100 million in surtax revenue. And the program is set to be administered by DESE and to help schools install and maintain clean energy infrastructure, things like solar panels or new HVAC systems. And then the House is also recommending through an outside section policy proposal an increase to the annual cap on MSBA grants from $800 million to $1.1 billion. That cap was last increased in 2019 under the Student Opportunity Act, in which it was increased to $800 million and then tied to be adjusted annually by inflation. And increasing the cap on MSBA grants by $300 million, I think, is really intended to help invite some additional districts into 2 of the MSBA's programs, the core program, which invited 10 projects into the system last year, and then the accelerated repair program, which sent out 33 invitations in 2022. Moving on now to some higher education spending. I'm going to speak first to the spending that the House budget includes specifically supported by income surtax revenue. And if you look first at the 2 pie charts that are on the right side of the slide, this is just looking big picture at how the governor and the House dedicated their income surtax resources. So in the governor's budget, we saw more than 1/3 of her $1 billion income surtax spending going towards higher education, so $360 million. Whereas in the House budget, we saw a much smaller portion, only 17% or $174 million dedicated towards higher ed. We saw much more, as I've mentioned earlier, going towards K-12 education in the House budget. But of that $174 million in investments for higher ed using surtax spending in the House budget, almost the entirety of it can really be understood to support student scholarship programs or scholarship-related programs. So like the governor's budget, the House included funding for financial aid expansion. They included $84 million, slightly less than the governor's $93 million. But similarly, the funding is intended to support an expansion of the Mass Grant Plus program, which is for public higher education students. The House budget also creates this new $50 million high demand targeted scholarship program, and it has a couple of unique elements. So number one, if you're a student who qualifies or accepts a high demand targeted scholarship under the House's proposal, you'd also be required to commit to living and working in Massachusetts for 5 years after graduation. The House budget matches the governor's plan to fund the Mass Reconnect program at $20 million, which is that proposal to offer cost-free community college to students 25 years and older. And then the House budget includes $20 million for the endowment incentive program, $10 million targeted specifically for the University of Massachusetts, and then $5 million each for state universities and community colleges. And the endowment incentive match program is not explicitly tied to funding scholarships for students, but many campuses do use endowed funds to support endowed scholarships. So in that way, it can be understood as much of the other House spending to support student scholarships and student financial assistance. The House budget funds the 15 community college campuses at a total of $336.1 million, or $9.4 million, about 3% more than the fiscal year 2023 budget. and $140,000 more than the governor. And that $140,000 increase over the governor is entirely related to a handful of amendments that were adopted last week during House debate. The community college funding formula is also level funded with the governor's budget at $10.1 million. And the community college funding formula directs some additional state aid to campuses based on some equity and student success metrics, as well as a couple other factors. And so all in, we see an investment of $348 million for community colleges in the House budget. Taking a similar look at funding for state universities, the House budget funds the 9 state university campuses at a total of $328 million, or $8.9 million, 3% more than fiscal year 2023. And again, this $50,000 increase over the governor's budget related to an amendment adopted last week during House debate. The state university funding formula similarly level funded with the governor's budget, and it's distributed to campuses based on very similar metrics as the community college funding formula. So all in $337.2 million for our state university campuses in the House budget. The University of Massachusetts is funded at a total of $695.2 million in the House budget, about $22 million more than fiscal year 2023 and $5.2 million more than the governor's budget. The standalone University of Massachusetts line item is funded at $688.4, $5 million more than the governor's. And that funding increase for the main UMass line item is tied to providing some increased student support and behavioral health student services for students at each of the 5 campuses. And this is funding that we first saw included in the state budget, I think in fiscal year 2021, really in response to some of the trends that we were seeing on college campuses related to coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we've seen it maintained in the state budget since then. And then I spoke about scholarship program funding supported by income surtax revenues, but I'm going to speak a little bit more to some of the other scholarship program funding that we see in the House budget. All in all, there's $373.9 million in total funding for scholarship programs in the House budget. That's a substantial increase, $59 million over the governor's budget, and nearly double what we saw included for scholarship programs just a couple of years ago in fiscal year 2022, when only $152 million was included for scholarship programs. And outside of that $174 million in surtax spending, we see in the House budget about $9 million for 2 scholarship programs related to foster care financial aid and adopted fee waivers. This $2 million investment in the high demand scholarship program, this is a different high demand scholarship program than the $50 million investment that I referenced earlier. This $2 million program has been in the budget for a really long time. It doesn't have the same sort of requirements to live or work in the state for 5 years after the fact. The House budget level funds the Community College Success Program with 2023 at $14 million, but that's $4 million less than what we saw in the governor's budget. And then we see level funding of $175 million for the state's main scholarship reserve. And then the last slide I have on higher education actually deals with a couple programs that span both the K-12 and the higher education sector, so namely early college and dual enrollment. And in fiscal year 2024, we saw in the governor's budget a total of $33 million dedicated towards these programs. So a really substantial increase than what we saw even just 5 years ago. In the governor's budget, $13 million was supported for early college under that main Executive Office of Education account. $10 million was included for dual enrollment, a portion of which can be used to support early college programs across the state. And then we also saw the governor dedicate the entirety of her K-12 surtax spending allotment towards early college and innovation pathways. In the House's 2024 budget proposal, we saw slightly less for early college and dual enrollment, $27 million in total, $15 million of which is related to that Executive Office of Education account, and then $12 million is coming from that dual enrollment account under the Department of Higher Ed. So slightly less than the governor, but still just the substantial increase that we've seen in funding for early college programs I think really speaks to some of the early success that we've seen in those programs and encouraging more students to participate and succeed in community and college coursework and to pursue higher education degrees. Before reviewing some of the notable action that took place during House debate last week, I do just want to touch quickly on some notable education outside section policy proposals. I mentioned many of them as we were reviewing spending earlier, but just so you can see them all in one place. In total, again, 93 outside section policies in the House budget. There were 47 coming out of committee, 46 new ones were added during House debate, and 5 big ones are related to education. So first, we have the section that's creating that Green School Works program supported by $100 million in surtax revenue. That's section 16. Section 17 is increasing that MSBA grant cap by $300 million up to $1.1 billion. Sections 15 and 18, like I mentioned, are making permanent the Universal School Meals Program. Section 7 is creating that high demand scholarship program funded at $50 million. And then sections 8 and 30 are related to a study of an early education and care program, the C3 Child Care Stabilization Grant Program. And I didn't touch on early ed and care funding in this presentation, but Ashley White, who I called out earlier, is doing a very similar presentation to mine tomorrow at 10 on early education and care. If anyone is interested in learning more about those investments, please feel free to put your email in the chat and we can get you that information. But now to spend some time reviewing what took place last week during House debate. So between Monday and Wednesday of last week, over the course of those 3 days, the House added $129.7 million in new spending to the House budget and 46 new outside section policies. 63.5 or $82 million of that new spending was specifically related to earmarks for local communities, organizations, or specific projects. 36.5% of new spending, or $47 million, was related to larger programmatic investments. The largest area of spending during House debate was Health and Human Services and Elder Affairs. It represented 30% of new investments in the House budget. 782 new earmarks were added to the House budget during debate, which is just a significant amount of earmarks. It's nearly double what was added in fiscal year 2018, over 160 more than what was added in fiscal year 2023. So we really saw an emphasis on adding funding for local projects in this year's House debate process. But that new spending of about $130 million was added through the adoption of 7 consolidated amendments, the largest of which was for Health and Human Services and Elder Affairs, like I mentioned, adding $38 million in new spending, followed by Labor and Economic Development, which added $31 million, and then Education and Local Aid, Social Services, and Veterans, which added $15.5 million in new spending. And of that $15.5 million in new spending specifically related to education and local aid, $9.3 million of that was for earmarks, and about $6.2 million was related to non-earmark, more programmatic spending. And I listed out a few of the more notable increases in funding that we saw added during House debate. So $3.25 million was added for 51 local education earmarks across the state. $2.4 million was added to increase charter tuition reimbursement, increasing that per pupil facilities rate that I described earlier. $1.1 million was added for civics education programs. $1 million was added in increased funding for the Department of Higher Education. And then we saw $500,000 added for the Genocide Education Trust Fund. So that's not an exhaustive list of all the funding that was added for education, but it is a kind of a list of the more notable items that we saw last week. So in terms of what we have coming next in the budget process, so we concluded last Wednesday night the House debate process, and we have the final House budget. And now we're looking ahead at seeing the Senate Ways and Means budget likely coming next week on May 9th. when the Senate Ways and Means budget comes out, we'll be doing, like we always do, a really comprehensive review of the funding and the policy that's included within it. So feel free to read our report when it's posted online, but also reach out and ask us any questions that you might have about the investments that the Senate includes and how they might differ from what we saw in the governor or the House's proposal. And thank you all very much. I know that was a ton of information. I really appreciate you all joining this morning. Happy to answer any questions that people might have.
Well, folks are thinking on that. I had a couple questions come through, Meaghan. So one is just about kind of looking ahead at the Senate budget. What are you kind of anticipating are some areas where you think sort of differences might emerge between the Senate and the House and the governor's budget?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think definitely of most interest will be how they choose to spend their income surtax resources. We saw some differences across the education and transportation buckets in terms of what the governor focused on and what the House focused on. Obviously, a much larger focus on K-12 education in the House budget than what we saw in the governor's budget. I think, we'll certainly see some differences. The Senate will probably have some programs that they'll want to own and some investments that they'll want to be independent from the governor and the House. So that's one area. I think in terms of K-12 funding, Chapter 78, it looks like, base Chapter 78 implementing the third year of the Student Opportunity Act seems to be the track that everyone will be following. But in terms of what happens on minimum aid, there could be some differences there, and that's something I'll be watching really closely as well.
Great. Oh, here's one coming through in the chat. Any idea why the Green Works program would be managed by DESE instead of the MSBA?
Yeah, that's another great question. So I think at least my understanding is that because the program is focused on some smaller scale projects, things like helping school districts buy and install solar panels or new HVAC systems, the House felt that DESE was kind of the more appropriate place for that program, whereas the MSBA is really focused on these huge, large scale, building entire new schools or putting in new boiler systems, new heating systems. Their focus is really on those larger scale projects, whereas this is a little bit more targeted in nature. And so that's why the House housed it under DESE.
Great question. Thanks, Patrick. Another question that came through the chat. Someone noticed the House sort of didn't fund some accounts in their budget. For instance, non-resident vocational student transportation. Curious if you think the Senate will likely include funding for this items or other items that may have not been included in the House budget.
Yeah, that's another great question. At least in the case of non-resident vocational school transportation, it has seemed to be practice in recent years for the House to exclude funding for that account and then for it to reemerge in the Senate budget. So can't speak specifically to what they might do, but it has been typical in the past for the Senate to kind of pick up some of those items that we saw excluded by the House.
Perfect. Last one that I have here is just about how increasing minimum aid with the Chapter 70 formula might impact different types of school districts across the state.
Yeah, that's a great question as well. And I think, like I tried to demonstrate in that chart that was showing how the minimum aid increase was being distributed to districts across low income groups. I think one of the benefits of increasing minimum aid from $30 to $60 is that it is a really targeted way to direct some additional state aid towards those higher and middle income districts that might be facing increased required local contributions, but aren't seeing the kind of commensurate increases in state aid that other districts are seeing due to Student Opportunity Act implementation. So really targeting those districts in a way that we know is based on student enrollment, because minimum aid is a per pupil allotment. And doing that, as the House has, allows you to see the impact of that increase pretty immediately, because you can run it through the formula, as opposed to a proposal like what the governor included, that $10 million reserve. If a distribution methodology isn't included, that's a little bit more open-ended. Sometimes proposals like that can work pretty well together. You provide an increase in minimum aid so you know where it's going. And then you offer this other money that can maybe be a little bit more creative in helping districts facing some of those challenges.
Interesting. That's all the questions I had for now.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much to everyone for joining us this morning. We really hope you find these presentations helpful. Like I said, our plan is to do another pretty comprehensive review of the Senate budget later on in the spring and the summer. So please join and please feel free to share them with others that you think might be interested. And then, of course, we have Ashley's presentation on early education and care tomorrow. So I know that she put the sign up link in the chat, but please feel free to sign up for that as well if that's funding that you're interested in learning more about. So thank you all. Really appreciate your time this morning. Hope everyone has a great week.